Most men think learning red pill principles is like flipping a switch. You read the material, you understand the concepts, and suddenly you're operating from a position of clarity. But there's a specific moment when that assumption collapses, and it's usually when reality doesn't behave the way the framework promised it would. I've watched this pattern repeat itself across different age groups, but it's particularly pronounced in men between 18 and their mid 20s. They consume content, they absorb terminology, they reference studies they've never actually read, and then they announce to anyone who'll listen that they've figured it out. The entire system, women, attraction, dating dynamics, all of it decoded. What's interesting is how quickly certainty sets in. 2 weeks of YouTube videos, a handful of forum threads, maybe a book or two, and suddenly the world is simple. Women are hypergamous, men are logical, the game is rigged, the rules are fixed. Everything fits into neat categories, and anyone who suggests otherwise just doesn't understand the science. But here's what I notice when I speak to men who've been applying this framework for years, men who've actually moved through relationships, not just theorized about them. They don't sound certain, they sound measured. They acknowledge patterns, but they also acknowledge exceptions. They recognize tendencies without reducing human behavior to a formula, and they definitely don't claim to have it all figured out. There's a specific type of reductionism that happens when men encounter red pill concepts for the first time. It's understandable. The framework offers clarity in a domain that previously felt chaotic, but the reduction goes too far. Women become nothing more than hypergamous creatures. Attraction becomes purely transactional. Every interaction gets filtered through a lens that strips out complexity, context, and individual variance. This reduction creates two problems. First, it breeds a quiet hostility. When you define another person entirely by their evolutionary programming, you stop seeing them as a person. You see a set of predictable responses, a biological algorithm, and that perspective makes genuine connection nearly impossible. Second, it limits your own development. If you believe women only respond to status and resources, you reduce yourself to a wallet, a provider, a means to an end. You stop cultivating the parts of yourself that actually generate attraction, presence, decisiveness, emotional range. You optimize for the wrong variables because you've oversimplified the equation. I see this play out in a particular way online. Men in their 30s ask questions in forums. They're trying to understand the framework, trying to apply it to their lives. And the responses come from men half their age, teenagers, college students, guys who've never held down a serious relationship telling men with mortgages and career responsibilities that they're too late to learn this stuff. The irony is thick. A 19-year-old who's read 3 articles explaining that he's already surpassed men twice his age in understanding. As if knowledge and wisdom were the same thing. As if reading about a pattern meant you could navigate it in real time. This is where the driving license comparison becomes useful. You can pass the test. You can memorize every rule in the manual. You can answer questions correctly on paper. But the first time you're merging onto a highway in heavy rain, none of that theoretical knowledge will replace the instinct you develop through experience, the ability to read traffic flow, the subtle adjustments you make without thinking, the mistakes you've already made and learned from. Red pill principles work the same way. You can absorb every concept. You can cite evolutionary psychology. You can explain hypergamy and mate selection and pre-selection. But until you've misread a situation in real time, until you've made a move that backfired, until you've watched a relationship deteriorate despite doing everything the framework said was correct, you haven't actually integrated the knowledge. You've just memorized it. I work with men in their 30s and 40s, men who've been studying this material for years, men who can articulate the concepts clearly. And when they describe their situations to me, the signals are obvious, blindingly obvious. But they missed them. Not because they didn't know what to look for, but because knowing what to look for and recognizing it in the moment are entirely different skills. They'll describe a scenario where a woman's interest clearly shifted, and when I point to the exact moment it happened, they pause. Now that you say it, yeah, that makes sense. But at the time, I thought I should just keep being consistent. The theory told them one thing. The emotional pull of the situation told them another. And they followed the emotional pull even though they knew better. This is the gap no amount of reading can close. You need pattern recognition that comes from repetition. You need the ability to stay calm when something unexpected happens. You need to have been wrong enough times that you stop assuming you're right by default. And here's where younger men make their biggest mistake. They declare themselves complete. I've learned everything I need to know. I'm done. I've taken the pill. The moment you say that, you've closed yourself off to new information. You've decided the framework is perfect and your understanding is total, which means the next time reality contradicts your expectations, you won't adjust your model. You'll just assume reality is broken. That rigidity creates fragility. If you can't bend, you break. And when you break in the context of relationships, it leaves marks: bitterness, cynicism, a defensive posture that never quite goes away. You start approaching every interaction like a test you need to pass instead of an experience you can learn from. I'm not suggesting the framework itself is wrong. I still operate from red pill assumptions. I still recognize the patterns it describes. I'm not suggesting you abandon the principles just because you've entered a relationship or because you've aged out of the demographic that discovered it first. What I'm suggesting is that conviction without experience is just another form of ignorance, and pretending you've mastered something you've only just encountered is a reliable way to ensure you never actually master it. The men who've genuinely integrated this knowledge don't talk about it constantly. They don't need to prove they understand it. They don't position themselves as experts after 6 months of study. They recognize that competence is quiet, that real understanding shows up in results, not rhetoric. I've also noticed something about the tone that's emerged in certain corners of red pill content. There's an anger to it, a performative outrage. Creators who've built audiences by getting angrier and angrier at women, at culture, at the state of dating. And their audiences reward that anger because it feels validating. But anger is a phase. It's a reasonable response when you first realize you've been lied to, when you first see the patterns clearly. But if you stay angry, if you make anger the foundation of your worldview, you're not thinking clearly anymore. You're reacting. And reaction is not the same as analysis. I understand the impulse. I understand why men feel betrayed when they discover these concepts. But staying in that emotional state doesn't serve you. It doesn't make you sharper. It doesn't improve your decision making. It just keeps you locked in a loop where you're constantly looking for evidence that you're right to be furious. The framework is supposed to give you clarity so you can move through the world more effectively. It's not supposed to become your entire identity. It's not supposed to replace every other lens through which you understand people. And it's definitely not supposed to trap you in a permanent state of vigilance where every interaction feels like a battle. There's a difference between being informed and being consumed, between recognizing patterns and seeing nothing but patterns, between using knowledge as a tool and turning it into a cage. When I see men who've genuinely absorbed these principles, not just memorized them, they're calm. They're not frantically trying to prove anything. They're not performing toughness or detachment. They've simply recalibrated how they interpret behavior, and they move through relationships with that recalibration in place. They make mistakes. They admit when they've misread something. They adjust. They don't claim to have figured out every variable because they understand there are variables they haven't encountered yet, and that understanding keeps them effective. So, if you're 19 and you've just discovered this material, I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm telling you that you don't know as much as you think you do. And the faster you accept that, the faster you'll actually start learning. If you're 35 and someone told you you're too late, they're wrong. You're not too late. You might have a steeper learning curve in certain areas. You might need to unlearn habits that younger men never developed. But the principles still apply. The patterns still exist. And your life experience gives you context that someone half your age simply doesn't have. But in both cases, the work is the same. Stop declaring yourself finished. Stop treating the framework like a gospel that can't be questioned or refined. Stop reducing every interaction to a single variable. Take the knowledge, test it, fail, adjust, test it again. Build the pattern recognition that only comes from real exposure. And stay flexible enough that when something doesn't fit the model, you're curious instead of defensive. Because the moment you convince yourself you've mastered this, you've stopped learning. And the moment you stop learning, the framework stops being useful. It just becomes another set of rules you follow without understanding why.